Okay, let's go up to January 6th, because your account is really extraordinary. And again, you were there, watching as the chaos unfolded. So talk to me about that. When you realized that things were dangerous, when they were really running off the rails, from your perspective.
I mean, from my perspective, I guess it's partially it's difficult to pinpoint one moment. In the days leading up to January 6th, so in early January, I began to become afraid of what could happen on the 6th. And my mom actually had been reaching out to me a lot too. Like, she didn't want me to go to work, and I wasn't fully processing all of it. The morning of January 6th, I remember driving to work that day, and it just felt bleak and dark, and there was like I had this sense that like something bad was going to happen. So as the day progresses and we progressively see things getting worse, I felt that something very bad was going to happen. I think the first moment where that really hit me was when we learned that the rioters had actually breached into the Capitol.
And you had worked in the Capitol. I mean, you knew how vulnerable the congressman would be, journalists might be. These rioters did not know who the people were. They were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence."
Well,
It was a
precisely.
dangerous situation.
Yeah, precisely. And it wasn't just a dangerous situation because they had gotten into the Capitol. It's exactly what you said. That the president had sent them there using his violent rhetoric. He had drawn this crowd to Washington, D.C. They had overrun Capitol Police, and they had bludgeoned their way into the Capitol. And in that moment, I'm thinking about, like you said, the journalists, the members of Congress, the staffers, both career and political, that I know that work in that building, and they're there for hopefully the right reasons. But it was also just an egregious assault on our democracy by the man who was sitting just steps down the hall from me, who wasn't doing anything to stop this.
Well, let's talk about that, because your testimony had some just dazzling moments where, for example, when Trump was upset that the rally space wasn't full enough, and he said, take the f***ing mags away, they're not going to hurt me, and take away the magnometers, the magnetometers that we're screening for knives and guns. And then, of course, there was the most jaw-dropping part of your testimony. Can I just play this one little clip? Because I want to ask you about it, because it really captures how close to being completely out of control that day was. Let's play that.
The president said something to the effect of, "I'm the effing president, take me up to the Capitol now." To which Bobby responded, "Sir, we have to go back to the West Wing." The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, "Sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol." Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel. And when Mr. Renato had recounted this story to me, he had motioned towards his clavicles.
So talk to me about that. Of course, there was a lot of attempt to discredit that testimony. They tried to focus on all of that, but you were relying on people you had worked with who told you what you thought was the true story. Exactly.
And I never testified that I was there or knew it firsthand. I simply recounted what had been recounted to me. Again, the validity of it, or how there are people that were in the vehicle with him that day that could truthfully answer those questions. But I think that what is important about that exchange too is really two things. One, specifically related to January 6th, is the fact that Donald Trump wanted to go to the Capitol. For what reason, I don't know. I could speculate. I don't know for certain. If he had gone to the Capitol that day, I would be I would really think that things would have gotten a lot more out of hand. And he had been warned in the days prior to January 6th that he could not go to the Capitol. We did not have the security assets to do so with the crowd size that we were expecting. And the second thing that I think is important from that specific exchange, whether, whether people testify and completely corroborate it under oath or they have their own stories, it's the fact that there is a lot of corroboration that he was very angry in the presidential vehicle that day, that he had wanted to go to the Capitol. And there are a lot of scenes like that that have emerged from the Trump administration that speak to Donald Trump's character and his character and lack thereof character. And he is a volatile, dangerous man who is willing to go to extreme lengths to achieve his end where he sees fit for himself. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves in this next year, in which you have done a phenomenal job and everybody at the Bulwark has done a phenomenal job at doing, and where I could see me hopefully being a positive contribution to this, is I have been on the inside. I've seen the dangers that he is capable of posing firsthand. I know the dangers that he continues to want to pose to the American people. And we really need to come together to educate people, not only about his policies, but about his character too, and the dangers of his character.
I think that's the heart of the whole thing. But so what, as you watch so many other Republicans who were there on January 6th, who understood that he was responsible for what happened on January 6th, as you watch them one by one find a way to rationalize it, to look the other way, just give me your thoughts about all of this. That you now have an election denier who is the speaker. You work with people like Kevin McCarthy in the past who clearly understood, as you did, the role that Donald Trump played on January 6th, and yet are okay with it. Your book basically is a warning about, look, this is who this guy was. This is what another term would mean. And yet, one after another, we are watching Republicans get in line behind him. I mean, you know these people.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that process. Because one thing you were very consistent on, may have taken you a while to break and decide to testify, but you were very outspoken in the White House in the days after January 6th that Donald Trump was responsible for this. Almost every Republican seemed to understand that on January 7th. And yet here we are.
Right. Oh, I think it's the Republican Party right now is completely devoid of actual leadership. And, it's disappointing to see. But it's a symptom of this Trumpism that has taken over our country. And I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know here,
Yeah.
but in my opinion, most of the Republican conference, the vast majority of the Republican conference has taken the route of appeasing Donald Trump and not, they're the people that have the power potentially, or at least could be powerful voices in this atmosphere about how he is so dangerous, not only for the party, but for the country. And I think that's what kind of blows my mind the most out of all of this, is even if you are a hard right Republican, you still care about the country. And Donald Trump is not the best person for this country by any means. I mean, he is frankly just completely undemocratic. But I don't want to go as far to say that they don't have time to course correct. They do. I am a firm believer that everybody can. It takes a lot of work and it doesn't happen overnight. But I think moving forward, it's not only that we have to focus on making sure that Donald Trump's name is either not on the Republican ticket next summer or on the general election ticket next November, but making sure that we're actually talking to constituents of people that live in Republican-leaning districts or swing districts. Because change starts with a foundation, and we need a strong foundation of people who actually care about the survival of our democracy and about our country. And right now we don't have that within the Republican Party. And we can't rely on the people that have been elected to serve in the House and some in the Senate, the Republicans that have been at least, to preserve our democracy. It's up to the people, and the people need to remember their power.
Well, and that's why your testimony and others, should be so important, because you're not a liberal Democrat. You are not a rhino. You were not even a never Trumper originally. And I guess and I'm sure you've given a lot of thought to this. The extraordinary thing about the Trump presidency are the number of voices from inside the room, people who work with him, whether it's the Attorney General or the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or his National Security Advisor or his own Chief of Staff, all of whom are warning about the dangers of a second Trump term. You were there in the room. You watched him. You are saying, to the American people, There's something fundamental at stake here. And yet, so far, it hasn't seemed to move, I'm sorry to use the phrase, move the needle among Republican voters. And again, it's one thing for Democrats or people who have been anti-Trump all along. It's one thing for Jamie Raskin, to rail about Donald Trump or Nancy Pelosi. But you folks were in the Trump administration. You were in the Trump White House. And your testimony is very graphic. It's very powerful. Why isn't it affecting the Republican primary race so far?
Because I don't think my testimony alone is enough to change the outcome or change at least the people who have
But
been
you're
in
not
power.
alone.
No, I'm not. But I say all that because my voice isn't enough to change everything. My voice is an important step to creating that change. And I say all of that because, I guess the way that I'm trying to approach this chapter of my life is there are a lot of people with a lot of credibility who have spoken out against Donald Trump. Like you mentioned, several of the former actual senior staffers from the administration, from different eras of the Trump administration. But telling people and explaining it to people are two different things. And telling people and actually engaging in a productive national conversation are two different things. And I think, and this is not I'm not speaking foully about how anybody else has approached this. I'm trying to learn how to approach this differently for myself because I have seen and witnessed that the way that we have communicated with people hasn't worked. It didn't work in 2016. He was elected. It didn't work it did work sort of in 2020, but by the skin of our teeth, he lost. And I think in this next year, we need to figure out how to engage people in an actual productive conversation because we need to create an inclusive environment and one where people aren't just being talked at. They need to feel that they can have a conversation with people like us, whether it's a literal conversation or we're communicating these dangers to them in a way where they actually understand it.
So what is your life like now? You had known pretty much everybody in the Republican conference. You knew everybody in the White House. Do you have communications with them? Have they reached out to you? Have you reached out to them? What do they think about what's happening now? What you have done?
Very few people from the Trump administration. Several members of Congress in both parties I still communicate with, and some new, which is very nice to have new faces too. But no, I'd be doing a disservice to your listeners and to myself and to you if I said this chapter and this part of my life has been easy. It has not been. But I think, I wouldn't expect it to be, and I think there's more reward to be reaped from that. Because if it was easy, I think that we would have a lot better of a chance at solving this problem if all this is going to be easy. But no, some days are still difficult because I recognize that I was complicit, but I also recognize the power of this moment. And if I could change one person's mind or open one person's mind in this next year, I've never asked for people to believe me. And I say that lightly because I want people to listen. And I think so often we communicate with people in a way where it's almost we're talking at them factually and we just expect them to believe us. I feel like creating a conversation for me where people are willing to listen, I think that will help lead to positive change. And so sort of trying to figure out how to do that is tricky, but it's rewarding being in this position and having the perspective that I have. And it's important for nothing else just to move forward as a country and know that to have my values sort of restored and there is a bright future to be had. We just need to engage the right people.
So what would a second Trump presidency be like? I've argued
you're asking me to catastrophize.
Well, okay, but I mean, the Trump 2.0 would be fundamentally worse than Trump 1.0 because he wouldn't have the grown-ups in the room surrounding him. He wouldn't have the people who would tell him what he cannot do. He has figured out perhaps how to use the levers of power. So, just briefly talk to me about what you think, what you're trying to warn against. What is at stake in 2024?
At this juncture, I look beyond partisan politics of this moment. We could sit here and debate what policies he would enact in his first day.
Right.
I think it's important to point out, honestly, on that, though, is this whole thing with his Schedule F, where he would essentially, allegedly, I guess I should say, has an executive order ready to sign to be able to fire civil servants in the federal government, which was also a big push at the end of his first term in office. Incredibly dangerous, playing into the larger point of if Donald Trump is the nominee on the ticket next year, we are not voting for a Republican platform or a Democratic platform. We are voting for the survival of our nation. And I will do whatever it takes to make sure that Donald Trump is nowhere near the Oval Office again, because, again, we are not voting for a Republican platform. People would be voting for a fundamentally undemocratic and dangerous man who has shown us time and time again that he does not have any regard for the Constitution and would go in with the mindset of a revenge presidency and surround himself by people who enabled him to achieve those ends.
Okay, so one last question. Let's play the catastrophizing scenario, and there is a second Trump term, and there's a 24-year-old young woman from Indiana who is thinking about going to work in the White House because she thinks that it's an honor and that she can make a difference. What would you recommend to her if you were sitting down with that young woman who you would understand completely? What would you advise her to do about going to work in the second Trump White House?
Oh, that's a hard question.
Yeah. I intended.
I would never. I would never want to discourage people from going into public service, and I think I would be doing a disservice to people if I did that. On that note,
run away, you're not going to be able to make a difference. You are not going to be the grown-up in the room.
But, I don't like to have that mindset, because even if I don't, testimony aside, there are more ways that we can create a difference than just by being there. She wouldn't have to witness something so egregious, like an assault on our democracy and on our capital, to recognize how fragile our democracy is. And I would hope to God that that wouldn't be the case for her. I hope that she would have a great experience, but I don't think that would be the case. I wouldn't encourage her to do it. I would give her all the information that I knew and give her my story and help her make an educated guess on her own. But I think what would be important to relay to her is that keep your eyes open and your guard up, and know that if push comes to shove, your voice is enough to come forward and not to feel ostracized in a tight little corner. And I think for me, at least, being in that environment and feeling and working to break out of Trump world for almost a year and then being brought back into Trump world, it's a really difficult place to leave, and you don't feel welcomed, or at least I feared not being welcomed.
Yeah.
Once I was on the other side by Republicans or by Democrats. And having the validation from Liz Cheney and from Alyssa Farah that not only was my voice enough, but that I would be welcomed by people, and I would have to answer hard questions, but I should be expected to. And I was complicit in this, and it's something that I owe the country as a duty to my nation.
Well, I was thinking about when you were talking about that moment of moral clarity where you felt that you kind of betrayed your own values, that you were remembering why you went into public service in the first place. And I think that would be good advice to say, just whatever you do, just remember why you want to serve your country, why you are a patriot, what you actually believe in. Because I think, as you saw, it's easy to get caught up in the fight. It's easy to get caught up in the glamour of it and the power and just doing your job. And I think that that's one thing that I think it's human nature sometimes that you in fact are dazzled for a while and you kind of forget why you were there. And I'm looking at all the congressmen and all the senators and all these important people and everything making the compromises. And I do wonder whether or not at some point they do, look in the mirror and go, remember what I thought I was going to do when I came to Congress? Remember what I thought I was going to do when I did all of this? And what have I actually become? And it's not a comfortable conversation. Cassidy, thank you so much for writing the book, because I think it was important. It answered a lot of questions, and I think it's a difficult thing to write about because you do acknowledge your regrets and you do acknowledge your complicity. And I think a lot of us have gone through this process of saying, why didn't I see that earlier? Why did I make that compromise? What was I thinking when I did this? what took me so long. So you're not alone in that respect at all. So Cassidy Hutchinson, again, the book is Enough, New York Times bestseller. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again.